I delivered this paper in Russian last Thursday, and I thought about presenting in Russian as well, but I think in keeping with the international character of the conference, it would be best if I presented in English, so I will proceed to do that. The topic of my paper is Soloviev and Russian religious idealism, with particular emphasis on critique of abstract principles. The lecture, this paper is based on the introduction that I am writing for the first English edition of Soloviev's brilliant doctoral dissertation, Critique of Abstract Principles, the last of his major philosophical works to be translated into English. The translation is by Boris Yakim, and it is excellent. Soloviev's treatise was a seminal text in the development of Russian neo-idealism, or of Russian religious idealism, as it might also be called. Within 20 years, religious idealism was a powerful current in Russian thought, forming the very core of the Russian religious philosophical renaissance. Together with Boris Chicherin's Science and Religion, which was published a year earlier, Soloviev's Critique of Abstract Principles laid the foundations for this remarkable age of philosophical creativity. In my introduction to the book, I try to lay out Soloviev's overall argument. I believe that this is worth doing because his argument is complex and its elegance, subtlety, and power can get lost in the text, which at points is labored and bears the marks of being a doctoral dissertation. Can everyone understand my English? Am I going at the right pace? Is it clear enough? Okay, good. Всё хорошо? Давайте продолжаем. Critique of Abstract Principles is a work of philosophical idealism, first of all, though it bears on related fields such as religious philosophy, which was the main subject of lectures on Bogochelowiechestvo written at about the same time. For Soloviev, philosophical idealism follows from the frank recognition that human consciousness, or more basically human personhood, is a mystery that cannot be explained in naturalistic terms. The mystery of consciousness lies in its capacity for the ideal. We are conscious not only of positive sense data, but also of ideals that cannot be derived from or reduced to empirical data. To explain the nature of the ideal, Soloviev invokes, following Hume and Kant, the philosophical distinction between ought and is. In the then reigning intellectual atmosphere of positivism, Soloviev wanted to restore the mystery of ought. He opens the first chapter of his book with the observation that, this is a quote, irrespective of the objective necessity of all the things that happen, we always apply to these things a certain judgment or valuation, end quote. Distinguishing between good and bad, true and false, beautiful and grotesque, noble and base. In short, between what ought to be and what ought not to be. He remarks, it is perfectly clear that from the purely objective point of view, we do not have the right to make such a distinction, for it has no meaning in objective reality, end quote. Not only do we not have the right, as Soloviev puts it, but it is hard to explain how such a distinction, how the ideals of consciousness could even arise were objective natural reality the only reality. From a naturalistic perspective, the mystery is not only our consciousness of ideals, but also our capacity to act on them, to determine ourselves according to them. This capacity might be called ideal self-determination. In fact, Sergei Trubetskoy, one of Soloviev's earliest and closest followers, used that very term. Kant called it practical reason, the power of reason to determine the will by its own ideals, such as the natural law. Soloviev regarded it as the distinctive human property. He named it the human principle and made it the middle principle in his tripartite conception of human nature. The other two principles are the material principle, by which human beings are part of the natural world, and the divine, religious, or mystical principle, by which we are conscious of the absolute. In lectures on Bogochelobiechestvo, he wrote, "The conjunction of these three elements form the actual human being. The properly human principle is reason, the relationship of the two others." The human principle of self-determination or practical reason depends on ideals such as the moral law, or at the highest level, the absolute. Both the moral law and the absolute, or the divine principle are forms of the ideal, and both, according to Soloviev, must be freely recognized and realized by human reason and will. The free human realization of the divine principle is the essential part of what he means by Bogochelobiechestvo, the central concept of his whole philosophy. By their nature, ideals are finite and absolute. So for Soloviev, the basis of idealism is human consciousness of the absolute, which consciousness, as I noted above, he calls the divine, religious, or mystical principle in man. The absolute is the common idealist term for God. Soloviev defines it as the all-one existent, sushia in Russian. He means that the absolute is the whole or the all-one, and that its essence or content is all unity, the term which designates Soloviev's metaphysics. He insists that all unity is a unity that fully respects the autonomy of its constituent parts, each of which must freely enter into it. For human consciousness, the absolute is an ideal, though it is existent in itself, in its own absolute sphere of being. Our task is the realization of the ideal in our relative sphere of being, to make the cosmos one with the absolute, and to achieve positive all-unity, the return of perfected creation to the Creator, and the realization of the kingdom of God. In some of his works, notably Justification of the Good, Soloviev calls the absolute or divine principle the image of God in us, while our likeness to God stands for the human principle of self-determination and perfectibility according to the image. Their combination is Bogochelobiechestvo, the ideal of humanity's divine self-realization in and union with God, deification or theosis, which is also the process through which cosmic transformation in positive all-unity is to be achieved. In the foreword to his dissertation, Soloviev defines abstract principles as those which are abstracted from the whole and mistaken for it. They result in various forms of reductionism. In one category, those forms include materialism, positivism, and abstract realism. In another category, or abstract rationalism, pardon me. In another category, they include what Soloviev calls abstract mysticism, abstract clericalism, or false theocracy, and abstract dogmatism, in all of which the divine principle, in one way or another, overwhelms or suppresses the human principle. For Soloviev, the critique of abstract principles presupposes the idea of the absolute all-one as the ground of true positive principles, which can serve as the criteria for the critique. These positive principles are, again, ideals for us, but they, and this is Soloviev, possess eternal being in the absolute sphere, end quote. It is clear that Soloviev's idealism is ontological in that he thinks our ideals are grounded in absolute being. One must not forget, he writes, that our present reality cannot be all of reality, and that which appears here as only that which ought to be or as only a thing of the future is eternally existent and genuine in another sphere, end quote. According to him, there are three supreme principles or ideals: the good, truth, and beauty. Two of them occupy him in the critique of abstract principles, the good and truth. Accordingly, he devotes the first half of his treatise to ethics, practical philosophy, and the second half to epistemology and metaphysics, theoretical philosophy. The 25 chapters on morality are the best in the book. Soloviev divides his account into two parts, pure or subjective ethics and applied or objective ethics. His own ethics, including his social philosophy, is deeply indebted to Kant. This is true even of Soloviev's social ideal of free theocracy, which has been seen as highly distinctive and has long been controversial, but which in fact closely follows Kant's great vision of the kingdom of ends. Soloviev begins with a critique of abstract principles in ethics. Such principles lead to empiricist theories, hedonism, eudaimonism, and altruism, that seek to derive the end or aim of moral activity from the data of sense experience, that is, from observable human behavior. These ethical theories, altruism in particular, may explain the psychological origins or motives of a moral act, but according to Soloviev, they cannot account for what is actually moral about such an act, for its specifically moral quality, since this can only be determined a priori by pure reason. Hence, the psychological or material principle in morality, in those theories in particular, hedonism, eudaimonism, and altruism, must be determined, must be brought under the rational or ideal principle. Soloviev's conception of rational ethics relies on Kant. He explicates the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals at length in his dissertation, embracing as his own Kant's seminal ideas there of autonomy, dignity, and personhood. The striking analytic character of Kant's practical philosophy is the basis of its truth if you accept the metaphysical premises of autonomy, that is to say, pure reason and will. Soloviev did accept them. They formed the middle, properly human principle in his overall conception of human nature. Kant's most famous idea may well be that of the person as an end in itself. It leads, in turn, to what he and Soloviev after him called the very fruitful concept of the kingdom of ends, which Soloviev regarded as the ultimate aim of all moral action. The kingdom of ends made a very deep impression on him. If every subject is a moral agent, he writes, and everyone else as an end in itself is the object of its action, then the general result of the moral activity of all subjects will be their organic unity in the kingdom of ends, end quote. This was the model for his own social ideal of free theocracy, which in the foreword to the critique he describes as the practical unity of all, vseedinstvo, by virtue of which all are the end, for each and each for all, end quote. The kingdom of ends was the link between his moral and social philosophy. Soloviev first presented his social philosophy in comprehensive form in Critique of Abstract Principles. It closely follows Kant's in structure and logic. For both philosophers, the foundation of society was external right in the political community of the lawful state. The rule of law makes possible progress toward the higher ethical community of the kingdom of ends, which Kant, this is quite striking, no less than Soloviev, thought of as the church. Soloviev makes his way to the philosophy of right and law through a powerful critique of socialism, which he sees as the most reductive and materialistic form of abstract economism in social philosophy. the other form being, of course, capitalism. The essential sin, his phrase, of socialism is in supposing that morality and everything else in human nature is wholly determined by the prevailing economic order. That observation may seem more obvious now than it did in 1880. Socialism seeks to limit humanity to its lowest material interests. In this, Soloviev says, it demands not too much from the working class, but rather too little. But its moral ideals, socialism's moral ideals, already contain the germs of its self-destruction as a materialistic doctrine. Socialism demands material welfare equally for all, but this demand can be made only in the name of justice, a moral ideal, and one that therefore cannot be derived from materialist foundations. The moral ideals of socialism, justice and equality, precisely because they are moral ideals, defeat its claims to materialism. Similarly, with the ideal that people have rights, this idea should not even arise on materialist grounds. By this type of immanent critique, Soloviev shows that socialism must pass beyond itself, from exclusive assertion of the material principle in human nature to recognition of the rational principle, which is the source of human dignity, rights, and justice. Further, the socialist ideal of justice cannot be realized without law and the state. Thus, Soloviev has demonstrated that the rational principle in human nature takes precedence over the material at two levels. First, at the basic level of morality, it involves recognition that others are not mere means for my material interest, but persons or bearers of rights. But since people cannot generally be relied upon to respect others' rights from moral duty alone, such rights must be protected at second, the juridical level of law and the state. Soloviev's conception of law was liberal, based on Kant's definition of right as external liberty under law. Law defines the limits of individual freedom, consistent with equal freedom for everyone else. Within those limits, people are free to set and pursue their own goals. The recognition of each other's freedom, which necessarily involves its mutual and equal delimitation, is what makes freedom into a right. Law was essential to Soloviev's social philosophy, but was not its highest principle. Law deals with the means by which people pursue their ends, but not the ends themselves. In the critique, he wrote that the equality of all before the law actually means that, this is Soloviev, all are equally limited by law, or all equally limit each other. This means that there is no inner or positive unity among them, only their correct division and demarcation, end quote. According to Soloviev, the ultimate moral significance of society is, and I quote, determined by the religious or mystical principle in man, by virtue of which all members of society are not limits for each other, but rather internally fulfill each other in the free unity of spiritual love, end quote. This principle is realized in the church. Thus, the normative society, Soloviev wrote, has as its foundation a spiritual union or the church, which defines its absolute ends, end quote. But the realization of the divine principle in society must be approached freely and consciously. It cannot be based on clerical authority or blind faith, and it must fully respect the human principle of rational autonomy in the form both of freedom of conscience and the rule of law. Thus, the true normative society, Soloviev wrote, must be defined as free theocracy. This was his social ideal, the way to the realization of humanity's divine potential, Bogochelowiechestvo. The meaning of Soloviev's theocratic ideal has long vexed scholars, and it remains a subject of contention today. A society freely united in love of God, all of whose members seek to fulfill each other in that love, is one that has attained a vastly higher level of moral development than anything in Soloviev's day, not to mention our own. To counter the view that it is an eccentric vision completely outside the philosophical mainstream, it bears repeating that free theocracy was very closely modeled on Kant's kingdom of ends, which the German philosopher conceived as the ethical community of a people of God, which is his phrase. Soloviev turns in the second half of his book from ethics to metaphysics. Free theocracy as the supreme moral ideal is based, he writes, on the concept of man as a religious being, on the recognition of the divine principle in man. For human consciousness, we know, the divine principle is an ideal, the image of God in man. But Soloviev asks, is it real? This question leads directly to metaphysics. Interestingly enough, he frames this question in terms of three others. This is Soloviev. First, the question of the genuine existence of the all-one being, or God. Second, the question of the genuine existence of man as an essential member in the all-one. That is the question of his immortality. And three, the question of his freedom. End quote. These are, of course, Kant's three metaphysical postulates. For Soloviev, they cannot be only moral postulates, as he thinks they are for Kant. They must be valid metaphysical truths. And with that, he turns from his first ideal, the good, to his second ideal, truth. It will come as no surprise that Soloviev makes his way to truth through a critique of abstract principles in theoretical philosophy, in theory of knowledge first of all. He holds that truth cannot consist only in an abstract relation in the phenomena of experience or the concepts of reason. Rather, truth, must consist in the real existence of the subject and object which are related through phenomena and concepts. A relation, after all, presupposes things that are related. Nor can the object be merely posited as a thing in itself, existing but closed to the subject and having no relation to it. The object must exist and exist in relation to the subject. In Soloviev's words, for true knowledge, it is necessary to suppose the unconditional existence of its object, that is, the truly existent or the all-one, and its relation to us, to the subject of knowledge. It is necessary to recognize, this is still Soloviev, that the principle of all unity, or the one which at the same time is all or contains all, exists for us not as an empty form or a mode of our reason's apprehension, but rather exists in its proper unconditional reality or as the truly existent. This principle as the all-one cannot be unconditionally external for the subject of knowledge. It must have an inner connection with this subject, a connection in virtue of which the subject can be internally connected with all that exists as contained in the all-one. End quote. All unity has several meanings in relation to the subject, object, and to their relationship. First, it refers to the basic principle of rationality or reason, which relates everything into a unity. All unity is the rational form of truth. Reason makes all one, all unity. Second, it, all unity, refers to the content of the form. The things that are correlated, all things, constitute the content of truth, Soloviev writes, and the one which embraces or contains all, being all, is the unconditional principle of truth, end quote. Third, all unity is a matter both of epistemology and ontology or metaphysics. All unity, this is Soloviev, as the genuine form of truth, can exist neither by itself, since form by itself, that is, without content, is an absurdity, nor in our reason alone, since this would be only our subjective thought. All unity as the form of truth presupposes the unconditional reality of that of which it is the form, that is, of the all one, which consequently is defined not just as truly thinkable, but as truly existent, end quote. Fourth, it refers, all unity, refers to the metaphysical unity of the subject and object. The fourth meaning of the concept seems to be its core. One of Soloviev's basic convictions is that the existence of the object, and even of the subject, cannot be deduced from sensations or phenomena or concepts. It must be taken, as he puts it, on the evidence of things not seen. That is, of course, Hebrews 11:1. That is, on faith, which for him constitutes a third type of knowledge, together with empirical and rational knowledge. This type of knowledge, faith in being, both presupposes and reveals the essential unity between the subject and object. Sensible, rational knowledge separates them. It objectifies being because such knowledge is necessarily knowledge of objects, even objects of thought, including the self as an object of introspection. It, rational knowledge, thereby removes being from the subject and itself. Faith discloses and restores their inner unity. Such unity means that subject and object are rooted in the same absolute being. For in the contrary case, this is Soloviev, the object could not pass over into our consciousness, and our consciousness could not penetrate into the object, end quote. Only by faith is it possible to know the all-one existent, or the absolute. In the depths of our spirit, Soloviev proclaims, we can find the unconditionally existent as such. In all human beings, there lies the immediate perception of absolute reality, end quote. Faith is precisely an immediate perception rather than the mediated perception of empirical rational knowledge, which by its nature separates being into subject and object. Faith reveals them in their all unity in absolute being in God. This is my final short paragraph. The truth that is disclosed by faith is not positively given in the manner of objects. It remains an ideal, and as such, it remains capable of driving human self-determination toward it. Truth as a positively given object results in external determination, not ideal self-determination. So far as I can tell, and this is my concluding point, Soloviev uses the term bogocheleviechestvo only once in Critique of Abstract Principles, and it is here, in the context of his treatment of the unity of the subject and object in absolute being. All unity can only mean that humanity participates in the absolute or in divinity. To preserve the human principle of ideal self-determination, Soloviev must thus distinguish between two poles of the absolute. The first is self-subsistent, God. The second is in the process of becoming man. And the full truth, Soloviev's phrase, can be expressed by the word Bogo Человечества. Thank you.